Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Paul Lancaster for inviting me along to talk to you today on the Growing and Scale Up Day. So, great comment here by Winston Churchill. What he's looking at here is the unwillingness to act by people, the lack of action, the lack of clear thinking, and really not doing anything until something jars you into action. And sadly, this has become a repetition throughout history, and we've seen businesses fail because of such activity or lack of. I'm going to talk to you today about how to strengthen your strategy with red team thinking, which is a methodology we'll be discussing. And hopefully it's going to allow you to move from your startup position into that scale up through the growth you need to become a larger company. My name is Marcus Dimbleby, and I'm one of the partners at Red Team Thinking. So let's start back in history. Back in the 16th century, just chap here with the fantastic name of Pope Sixtus V, not related to Pope Fiftus VI. He was a pope at the time, and during this period, the Catholic Church was getting overwhelmed with the number of people who wanted to be canonized, i.e. get sainthood, because obviously came along with that package was the offering of lots of money to go and do good deeds. And at the time, they were quite dubious about some of these claims. So they stood at what's called the Advocatus Diaboli, which translates in Italian Latin to the devil's advocate. And this allowed the Catholic Church to play the devil's advocate against all of these canons who wished to become saints and challenge them. And funnily enough, after a year of doing this, the number of requests dropped by 75%. And this has been going on to the present day. And the last one to go through this devil's advocate process was Mother Teresa back in 2003, believe it or not. And thankfully she passed. What this has shown us is the ability to start challenging beliefs and processes throughout the centuries. We next saw the Prussian army do this. Now, in the 19th century, they were getting pretty much slaughtered every time they went on the battlefield by Napoleon's army. And they invented something called Kriegspiel, which was wargaming in German. And what this allowed them to do was bring all of their best people together. And before they went into combat, they formulate around a table and take little wooden soldiers, which they painted red for Napoleon's army, because that was the colour of their uniform, and blue for their own. And they worked out how they could then behave and think like the army they were going to face on the battlefield the next time. And this is actually the first known red teaming that we can find throughout history, which allows you to think like the enemy, allowed them to assess all of the threats they were facing, also seek out the opportunities. It's not all about looking after the bad, it's also looking for what the good could be that's out there that you haven't potentially seen. Also, it allows you to validate your assumptions. Many assumptions we make today, we believe to be facts when they're not. And we base a lot of our big bets on these assumptions without actually validating and proving them. And also allowed them to ask, what if? What if this army position moved on our flank here? What if somebody came from our rear and attacked us in that position? How would we best defend that? So by going through these calculated processes and procedures, when they then went into battle, anything that then happened, they'd consequently plan for it and could react accordingly at the front line instantly without having to go back to the generals in the rear to ask for permission. Moving on to the modern era, the 21st century need for red teaming has become highly apparent. We all know what happened on September the 11th, 2001. What actually happened on September the 12th, though, was the CIA stood up what they called the Red Cell. And since then, militaries across the world have followed, governments have done likewise, and today businesses are doing the same, which allows them to have this capability to challenge. The Department of Defense formalized this by stating that all of these enterprises should have this ability to challenge the aspects of their own plans. And it's this aspect of deliberate challenge that is actually distinguishing the red team capability from other management tools. A lot of these tools that we see nowadays are strategic papers and these canvases that are out there. Sadly, they become what we call a tick box exercise, where yes, have you done this? Tick, 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 without actually validating and gaining the use from what they were first intended. Red teaming doesn't do that. Red teaming allows you to really go into the nuts and bolts of a plan, of a strategy, take it all apart, challenge, and put the things back together. So it doesn't write a plan or strategy. It takes a plan, dissects it, and then puts it back together and makes it better. And the DoD have supported this with the clear intent of what this is for. And it's evolved since then over the last 20 years. So looking at the startup perspective, I don't need to go into many of these because I'm sure you're fully aware of most of them. But the list is endless. But some of the major things why startups fail is clearly, is there a market need for the product or the offering you're trying to sell? Talked about growing and scaling up. Trying to expand too soon is often a hurdle that people trip over. And that normally comes from the rest of what's listed here. Poor strategic management. People who do and form startups are normally very good at building the product, understanding what's required, but they're not good at managing companies and growing them. We've been working with a lot of the challenger banks who have been highly successful in their quick to market products and enticing the customers. But if you want to grow Monzo from 1,000 to 20,000 people over the next 10 years, how do you do that without becoming as dinosaur-like compared to the big banks? Clearly, you need a clear and understood business plan. You need the cash to support that without racing forward and tripping up over that hurdle. And you need the organizational structure and the op model. What works for you for 20 people, for 50 people, for 100 won't work, however great it is, when you scale yourself to 500 to 5,000. Every time you evolve and grow, there's a certain point where you have to stop and totally reassess your structure, your op model, and the business plan that supports that. And it all boils down to planning. Now, Benjamin Franklin here, who we all know in the back of a $100 note, if you've ever seen one. Planning is not a dirty word, as Blackadder would have said. And if you fail to plan, then you plan to fail. And what we're seeing often now in the world of agile delivery is that we don't need to plan. We can just test and learn and experiment as we go, which is all well and good if you're doing small bets and quick iterations and experiments. But if you're doing something like a scale up of your business and you don't plan accordingly for that and it fails, then that's because you failed to plan. Now, hand in hand with that plan, you need a strategy that is able to deliver it. Probably all familiar with Rudy Giuliani here, who was the mayor of New York during 9/11. And you can probably recognize Hillary Clinton in the background there. Clearly ahead of their time with the masks there, aware of what's coming downrange today. But as he said here, when he was giving many of his speeches during 9/11, hope is not a strategy. We can't sit and hope for things to go well. We can't sit and expect things to go well. And referring back to the speech that I started off with a quote from Churchill at the beginning, we have to take positive action. And that's clearly what Giuliani was doing as mayor of New York at the time, to get on the front foot and lead rather than sit and wait for these things to happen, because they won't. So you have to have a plan and you have to have a strategy that's A, clear, B, understood by everybody, and C, actually executable. So why do we need red teaming? Well, if we look at throughout history from the business perspective, most businesses that go under don't die because of competition, don't die because of external threats, don't die because of the environment. They actually die through self-inflicted wounds. They literally put their own gun to the head and pull the trigger. And we've seen that through numerous decades of behavior, all the way up to recently with Thomas Cook. I mean, every weekend I've been seeing in the Sunday Times, yet another company has gone under. And that's only accelerating now that the VUCA environment is amongst us. And I've been talking about VUCA for the last 5+ years, but it's not really been understood. So let's look a bit more into that, if you're not aware of what VUCA is. So what is VUCA? VUCA's been around since the 80s. Again, it was another military term used for the post-Cold War operating environment that soldiers were finding themselves in. They were operating with volatility. We were operating in uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And this is now the world we're finding that businesses themselves are operating in. And as I said, I've been talking about this for the last 5 years plus, and it's almost been ignored by many of the big legacy organizations. They don't see this as a major threat or a problem. But until recently, clearly the biggest VUCA event of probably our lifetimes, hopefully, we've now entered into. I mean, this is unprecedented what we're seeing in the marketplace, the macro economy, our personal lives, our professional lives. This has hit everybody. And the key thing is now is, as Churchill said, how do we now respond to this? How do we now act? A lot of companies are knee-jerk reacting and going off excessively, making drastic cuts and trying to keep their metrics and their numbers for Q2 and Q3 aligned to their 2020 strategy. Others are taking a more staggered approach. Others are slowing down, identifying what the threats are, but also seeking out the opportunities. wherever there is bad, there is always good to be had. And can we pivot with our businesses and see what's emerging on a day-to-day basis with what's happening with COVID, with what's happening in business and the world in general? And can we utilize that to make something good for our company actually come of this, rather than panic, knee-jerk react, and drive ourselves off a cliff, which many we've seen have happened. So how does all this come together? Well, as you see here from Thomas Schelling, one thing a person cannot do, no matter how rigorous the analysis, heroic the imagination, is to draw up a list of things that could never occur to him. So it doesn't really matter how smart you are, how rich you are, how effective you are, how good looking you are. There are certain things that you just don't know because you don't know. And Rumsfeld talked about this back in, post 9/11. There are the unknown unknowns, and understanding what they are is really difficult. So you need a process that can surface these unknown unknowns and bring them to the forefront, because getting a different perspective on something means that you will see things through a different lens. And the C-suites, the CEOs of today, are no longer the supermen they believe themselves to be of the 90s. This is no longer an individual's capability to solve and to fix and to take forward. It has to be a group effort, because it's really, really complicated, as we've seen from what VUCA actually stands for. And it's even worse because Adam Smith, the philosopher, talked about 300 years worth of how we think and how our brains operate, and that we have a strict understanding of how we think about things and how our brain works rationally. And it actually doesn't. And Daniel Kahneman here, doctor, author of Thinking Fast and Slow, if you've not seen that and read that, he talks about our brain being a machine for jumping to conclusions, which it does. We get so quickly and easily influenced by what we see, what we hear, and what we believe, that our brains are almost erratic in their thoughts sometimes. Now, add to that the biases and heuristics that we face into, and there's just a small list here, but each one of these are clearly exampled, and you can understand how they impact our beliefs, our actions, and the decisions that we make. And this whole cognitive biases that's impacting us at all levels, at all times, every day, has to be addressed, because if you don't, then even if you do start to take action, then what we're finding is people are making the wrong decisions, but believing them to be right, because they've not fully understood everything else that's impacting on both their thoughts and their actions. And the biggest thing we see in most large organizations, so something to really consider as you scale, is the alignment that everybody wants isn't good when it's alignment of the ways of thinking. When we talk about diversity nowadays, true diversity you can have in a business to succeed is diversity of thought. Because as Patton said here, if everybody's thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking. And the Israelis formed a team after the Egyptians attacked them in the Yom Kippur War, that they had a team where for every 10 men, there would be someone in the room who would play the devil's advocate, who was there to challenge, think differently to what everybody else is thinking, because if you don't, everybody starts to become aligned, often with the biases of politics at play. If the executive speaks about an idea, everyone's on board. We had somebody recently saying, I want my team to challenge me, because every time I put a plan out there, they go, great, awesome. No feedback, no contrarian challenge. And that's not healthy. And especially in the startup, as you're growing and looking to become that bigger organization, you have to think differently, and others have different perceptions. So everybody should have a voice, and everybody should have a say at the table. So if you apply the tools of red teaming, what does it allow you to do? Well, as we can see there, it's like a game of chess, and business is without a doubt a game of chess. It's a challenge. The enemy also has a say, your competitor has a say, the environment has a say, and your consumer, your customer has a say. And consumers are now very much, in the last decade, getting ahead of businesses. So before we could drive out the demand quite easily, we could get ahead with what the products are. Now technology is moving so fast, the desire and the demand is coming from the customer, and businesses are having to struggle to keep up. So what does it allow us to do if we apply the methodology of red teaming? It allows us to counter those unconscious biases that I just talked about, of which there are many. It allows us to leverage the wisdom of the group. We talk about psychological safety, But really, when I talk to organizations, especially at the coalface, they tell me there is no psychological safety. The culture doesn't allow that. There's still a lot of fear in organizations. So again, the bigger you get, how hard is it to let go of the reins at the top and allow the coalface to start taking, a grip of what needs to be done? So how do you leverage that wisdom from them in a safe way? You've got to challenge those assumptions, and red teaming allows you to do that. It allows you to take all of those assumptions. What's the impact of them failing? What's the likelihood of them failing? Are they true? If so, they're not assumptions, they're facts. If they're not facts and they are assumptions, have you really understood them, or are you just hanging on them as a wishful thinking hope? We see that often. You've got to stress test those strategies. You may have a great strategy, or you believe it to be, but have you really run it through the mill? Often we get strategies handed down from the C-suite and the board of directors to the coalface to deliver. And those who are delivering it haven't been involved in the planning, and those who've written it haven't really understood all of the aspects that the environment is now challenging us with on a day-to-day basis. It allows you to identify those unseen threats. By thinking differently, those unknown unknowns can start to surface, can start to give you the heads up of what's going to happen downrange and allow you to plan for them. You can't often counter them or stop them, but you can be aware of when they're likely to surface, and then what is it you could possibly do to avoid, to pivot, to go around them, just as the Prussians did against Napoleon's army. It allows you to uncover those missed opportunities. As I said, this isn't all about doom and gloom and the threats that are out there. There are often massive opportunities that can really make huge impact and bonuses for companies that they completely miss. They're so focused on heads down, the glass is always half empty, rather than being optimistic and looking for the opportunities out there where they can pivot. And also often letting go of their baby in the bath, throw it all out with the water. We had a client recently who wanted to actually bin their best golden egg product in the States. And they wanted to convince the board that it was the right thing to do, because if they didn't, while it was a golden egg today, in a year's time, the competition was doing something new and they would come in and wipe them off the market. And we've seen this work with Polaroid and Kodak in the past, where people have failed to capitalize on something because they thought they had the best things in sliced bread. And within 6 months, and it happens even quicker now, these things can go overnight, they can quickly tumble. Also consider alternative perspectives. As I mentioned throughout this, you have a group of people who are super smart, super passionate, and super dedicated, hopefully. So why would you not maximize the capabilities of all those brains and fuse them together to get the best output? And also look at those different perspectives of things. Ask the most junior intern who's in making coffees for the summer and learning. Ask them for their perspective. You might get something very different. I do a lot of my work and I run it by my teenage daughters, just to get that sort of Gen Z millennial viewpoint versus the old man in the room's perspective, which many of these big organizations are run by, and we're seeing the problems that causes. Look at diverse options and ensure the best idea wins. Don't get so passionate and enslaved by your own ideas, because something could come out of left field and have a completely different viewpoint and impact upon your plans and strategies. And that's fine. That might be the right thing to do. And you have to have that acceptance that that's why we've created this team that we have. This is why we've been awesome as a startup. This is why we're going to grow and go forward as a huge capability, because we have a diverse bunch of capable individuals, and therefore we're going to allow their capabilities to be open and transparent and accepted, which is the best way to get the best out of your people. Because ultimately, all this is going to give you is the opportunity to make better business decisions faster. And we know companies do make business decisions, but we're seeing many of those are bad decisions, and many of them take too long, even if they are good. So how do you make the right decision, and how do you make it quick enough to get inside that VUCA environment, so you're operating at a speed and pace quicker than the environment around you is, than the competition is, and also sometimes your consumer and customer. Ultimately, what this does, it makes you one of the disruptors rather than one of the disrupted, sorry. And we call this deliberate disruption. So if you're brave enough to actually look at your plans and strategies and challenge yourself accordingly, using all of these tools and techniques and understanding the full 360 holistic picture, then you can do what we call deliberate disruption. Just as our client did to bin their golden egg to build something new, by doing that, you get ahead of the game. So when someone does come in and try and disrupt you, it's too late. They're already in your wake and you're ahead of them, leading the competition and enticing and engaging with your customers, which is ultimately the point of business at the end of the day. I've not made any of this up. Again, a lot of this has come from centuries of history, and my partner here on the left, Bryce Hoffman, who you can see, wrote the book called Red Teaming. So he attended the Army's schoolhouse on this for 6 months at Fort Leavenworth back in 2015. I've done 25 years in the military doing a lot of this in my day job. So together we brought that history that we've got together. Bryce wrote the book, and then we've been rolling this out across businesses across the globe. And we've gone online with this, offering a virtual capability as well since COVID hit us back in March. You can look more at redteamthinking.com. I encourage you to do so and engage with us via that medium. So finally, I'd just like to say thank you for supporting Paul this week with the Great Newcastle Startup Week, but also for listening and hopefully having some good takeaways from Red Team Thinking. And as Charles Darwin said, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. And it's how you change, how you challenge your current status quo, and how you adapt going forward is what ensures that survival. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and feel free to post any questions in the Facebook room.